I'm here because I made a mistake of telling Kaylee that I retired. She wanted me to talk about my professional career, the lessons I've learned. And I've heard talks like this before. It's really a killer topic. Usually puts everybody to sleep in about 3 minutes. But Shannon was more convincing, so she got me to take a little different look, looking back at almost 50 years. And I've always felt like I made all the right decisions, master of my destiny, and occasionally I've been accused of being a control freak. And in this room, I'm sure I'm not alone. So I'm gonna, when I look back, it's very interesting that there are many people who are already positioned along your way, and there are many events that are already set in motion long before you get there. Some of these were before I was even born. So I'm going to be telling you some stories. They're all factual, and they may seem disconnected, but if you don't run out for coffee, you'll find out they'll always come back together and tell us the story. So I'm going to go way back and talk about people and events that transported a 10-year-old boy from Shanghai to Seattle. For Nick, that's about 5,000 nautical miles. That's a family portrait done around the end of World War II. And it's my parents standing in the back. It's my great-grandmother seated, holding my brother Jack. My sister to her right, and that's me. And that's obviously a pre-op shot of someone who needs otoplasty badly. So in 1918, the H1N1 virus, which is still, as you know, hanging around, caused a global pandemic. It killed more than 50 million people. My father was orphaned at age 16. He wanted to be a doctor, but the family fortune was tied up in textile. And so his guardian, an aunt with large Western influence, insisted that he get formally educated in the United States. So she brought him here, and he went to NC State, North Carolina, and then did some graduate work in Lowell Tech in Massachusetts. Now, when he went back with all this great new technology, he found that it was not really applicable. But he made a lot of contacts during college and managed to make some connections. He managed to acquire the franchise for Sherwin-Williams paint for Shanghai. Went into contracting, and he will eventually paint Chiang Kai-shek's residence. Those of you, I see a lot of young faces. Chiang Kai-shek was the second president of China. In 1927, Duke University was founded by generous donation of a rich tobacco farmer named Washington Duke. He donated approximately $50 million, this is in the 1920s, to change the name of Trinity College to Duke University. 5 years later, Duke Medical School opened and had Wilbur C. Davidson as its first dean. Wilberson was 35 years old, and he was a pediatrician at Johns Hopkins Medical School and also assistant dean of the medical school. He proceeded to recruit and staff all of the basic science and most of the clinical science departments with Johns Hopkins medical staff. 1943, and probably a few years before that, there's the beginning of a communist revolution based mainly on the discrepancy of the rich and the poor. That sound familiar? And it was highly successful, very few real fights, mostly by propaganda. In the post-World War II, there was a lot of high hopes for recovery in China, and my dad was asked by the Sherwin-Williams Company to come to the United States to update. He didn't really like the idea of Mao, and thought that this might be a good time to take out visas and take the family on a vacation. Shanghai was under siege. Chiang Kai-shek moved his government to Taiwan. And there was one last commercial flight out of Shanghai, and my dad somehow managed to get 6 tickets. But for reasons I never found out, he turned those back. He thought that might be too late. And somehow he managed to evacuate the family on 2 separate military planes. Often thought about painting Chiang Kai-shek's house. As a big aside, that commercial airline did take off a few days later, but crashed on the way to Taiwan with no survivors. I think we skipped something. Well, I apologize for a slides being out of. So, if that gets stuck,
The next slide is the one that's supposed to be.
no,
There.
I think they're.
oh, yeah,
Might have to go back after this one to.
okay, thanks. So after waiting almost 3 years for visas through Taiwan and later Hong Kong, we managed to get out and landed in San Francisco, then over across country. Train ride, ended up in New York City, Christmas Eve of 1950. I went to public schools, but because of financial reasons, we moved to a small town called South Plainfield in central New Jersey. It didn't even have a high school, so we went to North Plainfield High School. I was all hot to become an aerospace engineer and build rocket ships. But by the time I got to my junior year, 2 science teachers, Marvin Blaustein and George Barkley, saw something else and got me interested in the biological sciences. So by then I got really interested in medicine. And one of the things that was very popular in those days were science fairs. And I succeeded in putting up 2 projects, one in my junior year, one in my senior year. And significantly, in my senior year, I won first prize. And the judge at the science fair was W. Brewster Snow, who was head of engineering at nearby Rutgers University. But shortly before that, he was in charge of civil engineering at Duke University. In those days, Johns Hopkins was the big name in medicine, and I had worked and saved up a lot of money and I was accepted there and was ready to go there in the fall. 2 weeks after the science fair, I get a letter from the admissions committee from Duke, and I have to confess, I'd never heard of Duke up to that point, offering me a 4-year scholarship. That perhaps was followed by one of the first major disagreements I had with my dad. He, of course, was arguing for the sure thing. So he won. And I spent nearly 8 years at Duke, Durham, North Carolina, and then started Duke Medical School. And at this point, I should be telling you about what a great medical school Duke is, but for the purpose of this discussion, I have to tell you about the Friday night poker games. So, from day one, 8 of us, that's an ideal number for Texas Hold'em, we formed a poker club. So every Friday after class is over, we would gather at the residence dorm they're never there. So we would play poker all night and usually quit Saturday morning. But once a month, 2 or 3 guys would drop out and say they have to go to the Army Reserve meeting. But that didn't take very long to find a solution. We moved the poker game to the Army base once a month. The problem is the sergeant at the gate made us sign in before he would let us into the Army base. In 1962, the state of Massachusetts authorized the building of a new medical school. It was to be located in Worcester, Massachusetts, 40 miles west of Boston. Totally opposed by every medical school existing in Boston and the medical community in general. In 1963, I think everybody knows who Alfred Blaylock is, right? In case you don't, he is a famous surgeon at Johns Hopkins. He went through their system, but actually failed to get a staff position. So he went to Vanderbilt, where he did most of his landmark research on shock and on cardiopulmonary circulation. But later on, he was appointed chief surgeon at Johns Hopkins University and the medical school. Well, he's about to retire, and there were 2 heirs apparent sitting, waiting to compete for that spot. But the search committee had a different idea. So instead, they selected George Zeideman, who was at Michigan at the time. He went to the medical school at Johns Hopkins, but did his general surgery at the MGH in Boston. So now with that position filled, the 2 guys had to go somewhere. The man on your lower right is David Sabiston, a native of North Carolina. He went back to Duke. Henry Bonson, on your lower left, went to Pittsburgh. Now along the way, I'm sure most of you have been given warning about not to complicate your medical school and your residency career. Don't get married during medical school. Well, I wasn't listening very carefully. So I got married in my 4th year in medical school to my pediatric intern. And but when we got to the matching time, I ended up at Duke and she in Boston. Obviously, that's not a very good solution, so I headed to Boston looking for a residency. For the residents, those days, they were separate. And there were 2 separate residencies. I think Nick and I are the only people around who have 2 boards. So I went up. There were 3 places available, a Tufts service at Boston City, and 2 Harvard programs, one at the Brigham and one at the MGH. Franny Moore, who's a famous surgical physiologist at the Brigham, interviewed me through a ham sandwich, said how good my record was, but he only took Harvard boards. Had a nice interview with Paul Russell at the MGH. He said he would let me know. He had other people to interview. At Ralph Ederling at Boston City pretty much assured me that I would have the place if I ranked him high. I really like the MGH, as Nick will tell you. Those who've been there, it's a special place. So, what would you do? Well, I was very naive, stupid, or both. So I called Dr. Russell up. John Holman's distinguished professor of surgery, Harvard Medical School, and chief of surgery, MGH. We had a nice chat. He remembered me. I told him my situation, that I could go to Boston City, but I really wanted to go to MGH. And we had a nice talk. He said, I'll see what I could do. The next day, I got a telegram. For the residents, that's a telegram. Wait a second. That thing is a telegram. It's kind of the forefather of the fax machine. It's a teletype machine. The message comes down on tape, they paste it on a piece of paper, fold it, and put in an envelope, and it's delivered by messenger. And anyway, it says, I've been accepted. So, Nick's shaking his head, that'll never happen in real life, but it did. So I was totally,
My story was the same.
I was totally, I'm sorry?
My story was the same. Okay.
I was elated. I was walking down to the mailbox in the basement of Duke Medical School, and the first letter I opened started with greetings from the President of the United States. Now I know there's no more draft right now, but usually it's followed by report for whatever, see if you qualify. If you don't have a bone spur in your foot, you gotta do something. Or if you defer for some reason. Remember those poker games? By then, we've been going to reserve meetings for 2 years. And I'm now in the Army Reserve. So, general surgery residency, the MGH. Again, I didn't know anything better. Since my interest was in the heart, I thought I'm going to be a cardiac surgeon. I worked with a bunch of cardiac surgeons at the Mass General, except for 1 or 2 exceptions. I looked at them and I said, that's not really me. And I got to meet John Constable and Brad Cannon. And they totally changed my view. And I wanted to be a plastic surgeon, but there were no residencies at the Mass General. It would not be one for at least 3 more years. So at that time, I went for the best place that I heard of, Pittsburgh. And John Constable and I had a very special relationship, and I was going to go back and join him in practice. Now, what's waiting for me in Pittsburgh? It's the Division of Plastic Surgery, which is not academic. It's run by William L. White, affectionately known as Willie, and 4 of the plastic surgeons in private practice. Remember Henry Bonson? He's now chief of surgery, and he wants a full-time division chief. Well, the 2 years go very fast, and we were back, and then it was John Remmenschneider and Jerry Austin. And so the deal is, I would go back, but I would spend majority of my time in the lab. There was no residency, and I would have 1 operating day a week. And I thought I was too young to die as a plastic surgeon. I needed to make sure that you could teach, but you still need to know what to do. And so I went back to Pittsburgh and told Willie what happened. Now Willie offered me 2 other choices. I could go back to the MGH and be in the academic track, but operate 1 day a week. Or Willie said he would step down and I could be the first chief of the division, but I'd be working for Henry Bonson. Or I could join him in practice. Which one do you think I took? I took the last. I would be between him and Bonson my whole life. Interestingly, after about 1 year in Pittsburgh, the medical school that was authorized by the state legislature in Massachusetts finally is being built, and they were recruiting. Anyway, make a long story short, I was appointed chairman of the division, but I didn't know what I was going to run into. It was one of the worst town gown situations I've ever known. It turns out the senior most plastic surgeon in town and the rest of his colleagues thought it would be natural that he would be the first division chief at the medical school when it came, and it wasn't not going to be some guy from Pittsburgh. So it took a long time to quiet down the crowd, and it took 2 or 3 years for the school to be finished. So we finally moved in 1974. But the main reason I took that job is because of Brownie Wheeler, who is a Harvard graduate that is training at the Brigham and had a vision for the school and the department. 75, 76, Wally finally did retire, and the search committee, headed by Henry Bonson, came to Worcester. By then, I was heavily involved and I was committed to what we were doing in Worcester. So I took my name off the list. There's no time to tell you what happened in between, but I moved to Seattle in 1982 and ran into Lauren Ongroff, who was reminiscent of what I was doing about 5 years ago, before that.
Why did you leave Worcester? Why did you do that?
It'll take another half hour. So, in the 7 or 8 years I was there, the main reason I took this job was because I wanted a department the way I wanted it, without the infighting. So I have a residency approved. I had a combined ortho hand service, a combined ENT head and neck service. And there was no microsurgery, by the way. We had to teach ourselves how to do microsurgery. And a wound healing study, a tissue culture laboratory. We got 2 books published. And we're heavily into intravascular coagulation research. And we had a division PhD, which did most of the work, and started a burn unit in the University Hospital. And we reorganized the Central Massachusetts cleft team. So it was an experience that I wouldn't pass up again. The lower picture is what the grounds looked like before the medical school came. And some of the buildings are the way it is now. What I missed in Renton when I first came was, first of all, residents and medical students. I missed the research, and there was no microsurgery being done in Renton at the time. And the cleft team was at the U. So the first few years were kind of tough. But luckily, the UW program got approved in 1988, and because of the way it was then, and the case loads and so forth, the Renton Clinic was part of the residency rotation. So that was a saving grace. All the residents since day one have rotated through Renton. And I talked to Dave Barker, he's a guy on the lower right. Can't do microsurgery by yourself. So we're doing some replants and free flaps until the service at Harborview picked up, and we quit doing that. So I gotta leave you a few lessons learned. It's easier to go from academics to private practice and vice versa. I guess that's kind of obvious. I've never allowed cosmetic surgery to exceed 25% of my practice. I think most books are probably not worth the effort, having done 2. It's really embarrassing that when your book comes out, somebody's going to ask you, well, what happened to the latissimus flap? And so, you could do research, you could do clinical research, but don't kid yourself that you're going to be a world-class basic scientist and be a full-time clinician at the same time. It's not possible. Woody White used to say, it takes 24 hours to be a good basic scientist, and it takes 24 hours to be a good clinician. So the best basic science clinician could be is a half-ass researcher and a half-ass surgeon. And as always, the best, most satisfying part about practice is giving back, which includes teaching residents and volunteering on mission trips. And so, what guided my journey? Luck, a lot of hard work, and a bit of serendipity. Thank you. Any other question other than why I left Worcester?
So I just wanted to point out to all the residents in the room, you know, we have 24 residents now, which is a lot bigger than we started with one.
Yeah.
We would not have a residency program at the UW were it not for you.
Thank
Because
you.
you were the academic linchpin in the Renton group that allowed Lauren to make this part of our academic residency. I mean, we had one faculty member at the UW, and then the 5 of you, and you made our residency. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. You're very kind.